Listen closely, closer than you've ever dared before. Do you hear it? That sound like silk tearing in a locked room? Like wine spilling on Persian rugs at 3 in the morning? That's the sound of a man destroying himself in pursuit of what was never meant to be caught. I knew a man once. Perhaps it was me, perhaps it was you, who collected butterflies. Not with nets and killing jars, but with promises and desperate texts at 2:47 a.m. He'd pin them to his wall with declarations of love, each "I need you," another needle through gossamer wings. And like all collectors, he wondered why his specimens never flew anymore, why their colors faded the moment he finally held them. Machiavelli whispered it first, that old Italian ghost who understood power better than he understood his own loneliness. Men are so simple and so ready to obey present necessities. But he never finished the thought, never admitted what happens when the necessity is her, when the present need is to possess what possession itself destroys. Picture this, a man standing in a cathedral of his own making, built from every unanswered message, every forced laugh at parties where she looked through him like cathedral glass. The stained windows cast colored shadows of all his trying, ruby red desperation, amber anxiety, that sickly green of jealousy that tastes like copper pennies left too long in the rain. And there, at the altar, sits an empty dress, white as bone, hollow as promise. The Greeks had a word for it, pothos, the desire for what is absent, the longing that feeds on its own hunger. They carved it into marble, this reaching for what retreats, this grasping that guarantees the slipping away. But we modern fools, we've digitized our pothos, turned it into red receipts and typing indicators that appear and disappear like fireflies in a jar we've forgotten to punch holes in. Here's what they won't tell you in those relationship podcasts, won't admit in their therapeutic frameworks, sanitized of all honest darkness. Pursuit is the art of creating distance. Every step forward pushes her 2 steps back, not because she's cruel, but because you've made yourself into something that must be fled from. A hurricane of need dressed in a 3-piece suit. I once watched a man at a jazz club, let's call him everyone, let's call him no one, buy drink after drink for a woman who smiled like she was counting down the seconds until closing time. With each martini, each lean-in, each rehearsed story about his promotion, she seemed to shrink, to become translucent, until I swear I could see the neon exit sign glowing through her chest. By the last call, she had become completely invisible, and he was still talking to the space where she used to be. You want to know the mathematics of repulsion? Here's the formula they discovered in a 2024 study from the University of Elsewhere, published in the Journal of Things We Already Knew but Refused to Believe. For every unit of pursuit beyond the point of expressed interest, attraction decreases by 1.7 units. They dressed it up in statistical significance and p-values. But what they really discovered was this. Desperation has a smell, and it smells like dying flowers in yesterday's cologne. The Sufi mystics knew better. They wrote love poems to the beloved who could never be possessed, understanding that the divine retreats from grasping hands but dances with open palms. They spun in circles until the world blurred, until they became the absence they desired, until they were empty enough to be filled. But you, tell me, when did you last let silence do your talking? When did you last become interesting by becoming absent? When did you realize that the spider doesn't chase the fly, but weaves and waits, until flying into the web seems like the fly's own brilliant idea? Here's your first uncomfortable mirror, held up in candlelight that flickers with your own unsteady breath. What would happen if you stopped? Not gave up, not grew bitter, but simply stopped. What if you became the flame instead of the moth? The tragedy isn't that we want what we can't have. The tragedy is that we can't stop wanting it in ways that guarantee we'll never have it. We've turned love into a performance where we've forgotten that the audience has already left, that we're dancing alone on a stage littered with roses no one threw. There's an old Romanian proverb, whispered by grandmothers who've buried more hopes than husbands. The hunter who chases 2 rabbits catches neither. But the hunter who sits still sometimes finds the rabbit sleeping in his lap. They say it while knitting scarves for grandchildren who'll never visit, understanding something about patient emptiness that we've forgotten in our age of instant everything. So, here you sit in the museum of your own trying, surrounded by exhibits of every time you tried too hard. That paragraph-long text explaining your feelings. That surprise visit that surprised no one more than yourself. That gift that cost too much and said too little. The security guard is asleep. No one's coming to visit. The only sound is your own breathing and the quiet tick of her absence growing larger with each beat of your reaching heart. The moth doesn't choose the flame because it's wise. It chooses the flame because it mistakes destruction for illumination, confuses burning for becoming. But you're not a moth. You're a man who's beginning to understand that sometimes the light you're drawn to is just the reflection of your own desperation in her retreating eyes. She loved you best when you loved her least. There's a moment, perhaps you felt it, when the air changes. Like stepping from a mausoleum into sunlight. Like the first breath after nearly drowning. It happens the instant you stop caring. And suddenly, mysteriously, she remembers your name. I'll tell you a secret that tastes like absinthe and sounds like Chopin played in a minor key at 4 a.m. Indifference is the most powerful aphrodisiac ever discovered, and it comes in a bottle labeled, "Finally Moving On." But here's the cosmic joke. You can't fake it. She knows. They always know. Women can smell performed indifference like sharks smell blood in water. Except they swim away from it, disgusted by the theater of your trying not to try. Consider the strange case of Marcus. We'll call him that because all heartbroken men are named Marcus at 3 a.m. For months, he was a loyal subscriber to her Instagram stories, a digital ghost haunting her every update. He memorized her coffee order, oat milk cappuccino, extra foam, just like her capacity for caring. He appeared at every party she might attend, a probability calculated with the precision of a lovelorn mathematician. Then came the fever. Not love, he'd already survived that, but something else. Exhaustion, perhaps. Or that peculiar strain of clarity that only comes after you've made a fool of yourself so thoroughly that even your shadow is embarrassed. He deleted her number, not blocked. That would still be a form of connection. Just deleted. Like erasing a misspelled word. 3 weeks later, at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, that meant nothing. His phone lit up. "Hey stranger, been thinking about you." Schopenhauer, that cheerful fellow who understood suffering like a sommelier understands wine, wrote, "We can regard our life as a uselessly disturbing episode in the blissful repose of nothingness." But he missed the punchline. Sometimes that nothingness becomes magnetic. Sometimes your absence creates a gravity that your presence never could. Here's what the neuroscientists discovered in their sterile labs in 2023, measuring dopamine like Victorian collectors pinning butterflies. Anticipation releases more pleasure chemicals than satisfaction ever could. The maybe, the perhaps, the what if. These are the drugs that make addicts of us all. But certainty is rehab. Certainty is sobriety. And nobody ever wrote a love song about sobriety. I once knew a woman, let's call her everyone's mistake, who kept a journal of all the men who'd stopped calling. Not the ones who kept trying, those she forgot like yesterday's weather. But the ones who vanished? She wrote their names in cursive, wondering. The wondering became wanting. The wanting became a weight that pressed against her chest like unspoken words. You see, we've built our entire romantic mythology on a foundation of pursuit. The knight rescues the princess. The hero wins the girl. But nobody mentions that the princess was only interesting while she was trapped in the tower. That the girl only glowed because she was running away. The moment she's rescued, the moment she's won, she becomes furniture in your fairy tale. And furniture doesn't inspire poetry. The Buddhists have a teaching about this, wrapped in saffron robes and the smoke of sandalwood incense. When you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him. They're not advocating violence. They're warning against the worship that makes idols of what should remain fluid. Love, like enlightenment, dies the moment you think you've achieved it. But here's where it gets delicious, where the paradox turns back on itself like a snake swallowing its own tail. The moment you truly stop caring, not pretending, not performing, but honestly cease to need her, is precisely the moment you become what she was looking for all along. A man sufficient unto himself, a flame that burns without needing her oxygen. There's a text message saved in 1 million phones right now, variations on a theme. I miss what we had. Not, I miss you. Never, I miss you. Because you implies the present person, the one who learned to live without them. They miss the earlier version, the one who needed them, the one whose happiness depended on their barometric moods. They miss the power, not the person. I'll share something that happened last week, or last year, or in 1847. Time becomes irrelevant when you're discussing eternal patterns. A man sat in a coffee shop, reading Marquez, genuinely absorbed. His ex-girlfriend walked in with her new boyfriend, the one she'd insisted was just a friend, back when words still meant something. She saw him there, lost in his book, and something shifted in her face like tectonic plates creating new mountains. He didn't look up, not once. Later, her new boyfriend would ask why she seemed so quiet. She wouldn't have an answer, just a strange emptiness where certainty used to live. You want to know the truth that therapists will bill you $200 an hour to avoid saying. Here it is, free of charge. We only value what might leave us. We only chase what runs. We only love what we're not sure loves us back. The velvet prison is this. The moment she knows she has you completely is the moment you cease to exist as anything more than emotional furniture. Comfortable, reliable, ignorable. But the moment you slip away, you become real again. Three-dimensional, worthy of pursuit. There's a passage in Kierkegaard, buried in his journals like a confession he couldn't bear to publish. The most painful state of being is remembering the future, particularly the one you'll never have. But what he didn't realize is that this pain, this remembering of futures lost, is what makes someone unforgettable. You become the road not taken, the question mark that haunts every certainty. So here's your second uncomfortable truth, served cold with a garnish of bitter herbs. When was the last time your absence spoke louder than your presence? When did you last become valuable by becoming scarce? The velvet prison has no bars because it doesn't need them. We lock ourselves in with our availability, our consistency, our predictable devotion. We become the sure thing in a world that only values mysteries, the solved equation in a universe that prefers the unsolvable proof. But perhaps, and this is just a whisper from one prisoner to another, perhaps the key to the velvet prison isn't trying to make her love you. Perhaps it's learning to love the version of yourself that doesn't need her to. Every relationship has already ended. Some just haven't stopped moving yet. Come closer. I want to show you something beautiful and terrible, like a sunset over a graveyard, like a love letter written in disappearing ink. It's the garden where all relationships go to pretend they're still alive, where couples water dead roses and call it commitment. There's a word in Japanese, mono no aware, the pathos of things, the gentle sadness of transience. The cherry blossoms are most beautiful because they fall. But we Western fools, we've built entire industries on denying this truth, on CPR for corpses, on ventilators for love that stopped breathing months ago. But nobody wants to call time of death. I met a couple last spring, or was it last century? Time moves differently in the garden of dying roses. They'd been together 7 years, wore matching sweaters to Christmas parties, shared a Netflix password like a blood oath. But if you looked closely, and I always look too closely, it's my particular curse, you could see it. The way they touched without feeling, kissed without tasting, said, I love you, like a sneeze, automatic, meaningless, followed by a brief silence. Here's what Nietzsche knew but was too polite to say directly. We don't end things when they die. We end them when the smell becomes unbearable. Most relationships are taxidermy, stuffed and mounted. Glass eyes staring at nothing, fooling only the willfully blind. We've become curators in museums of our own making, dusting off dead things and calling it love. A study from Oxford in 2024, those brave scientists who measure heartbreak in standard deviations, found that 73% of couples stay together an average of 18 months after emotional death. 18 months of puppet shows, of ventriloquism, of moving the mouth of something that has no voice. They called it relationship momentum. I call it the cowardice of comfort. Let me paint you a scene that happens every night in 1,000 different houses. She's scrolling through her phone, occasionally showing him something that makes her laugh. He makes the appropriate sound. That half chuckle that means, I acknowledge you've shared content. They're sitting on the same couch but might as well be on different continents. The TV plays something neither chose. This is what death looks like when it wears pajamas and pays half the rent. The ancient Egyptians mummified their dead, wrapped them in linen, surrounded them with treasures for the afterlife. We do the same with relationships, anniversary dinners at the same restaurant, sex on birthdays and holidays like prescribed medication, conversations about the weather in places we'll never visit. We're so good at preservation, we've forgotten that some things are meant to decompose, to return to the earth, to make room for new growth. You want to know when your relationship died? I'll tell you. It was the first time you chose comfort over truth. The first time you swallowed words that needed saying because dinner was getting cold. The first time you felt lonelier with her than without her, but stayed because at least it was a familiar loneliness. Broken in like old shoes that give you blisters you've learned to ignore. There's a legend from medieval France about a knight who carried his dead beloved on his horse for 7 years, convinced that true love could resurrect her. Village after village he rode, her body becoming lighter as it desiccated, easier to carry, easier to pretend she was just sleeping. When they finally convinced him to bury her, he realized he couldn't remember what her voice sounded like. He'd been in love with absence for so long, presence had become theoretical. But here's the savage grace, the terrible mercy. Everything that dies was meant to die. The relationship that could have lasted forever ended precisely when it should have. At the last moment of genuine feeling, the final instant of authentic connection. Everything after that is just ego refusing to admit defeat, fear dressed up as devotion. I'll tell you something that happened to me, or to you, or to everyone who's ever mistaken habit for love. We were lying in bed, Sunday morning, sunlight like honey through cheap curtains. She was talking about her dreams, the sleeping kind, not the ambitious kind. We'd stopped discussing those months ago. I realized I was counting the cracks in the ceiling, that I'd been counting them every Sunday for a year. 17 cracks, 17 Sundays, 17 opportunities to say, this isn't working, that I'd let pass like buses I was too tired to catch. The Stoics had a practice, memento mori, remember death. They kept skulls on their desks, not from morbidity but from wisdom. To remember that everything ends is to taste each moment fully, to stop wasting time on what's already gone. But we've replaced memento mori with memento more. Remember to want more, to try harder, to fix what was never broken because it was never whole. Here's your third uncomfortable mirror, and this one's cracked down the middle. What are you watering that's already dead? What corpse are you dancing with? And why does the music sound like a dirge played at half speed? The garden of dying roses smells sweet at first. Decay always does. It's only later you realize it's the sweetness of rot, of things breaking down at the molecular level, of love letters turning back into wood pulp and good intentions composting into resentment. But listen, lean in close because this is the part they don't want you to know. There's something holy about letting things die when they're supposed to. There's a dignity in attending the funeral instead of keeping the body in your living room. There's a strange, fierce joy in burning the garden down and planting something new in the ashes. The relationship ended the moment you started performing it instead of living it. The moment you became actors who'd forgotten they were acting, who'd lost the script but kept mouthing words that might have meant something once. The moment you chose the familiar cemetery over the unfamiliar road. Some roses are meant to die in winter. That's what makes spring possible. That's what makes new growth more than just a metaphor we tell ourselves while watering plastic flowers and pretending they'll bloom if we just believe hard enough. The garden is burning. Can you smell the smoke? It smells like freedom. It smells like the end that makes beginnings possible. It smells like the truth you've been too terrified to tell. You were never in love with her. You were in love with who you became in her presence. Midnight. A man sits in an empty apartment, surrounded by the archaeology of a love affair. A toothbrush that isn't his. A pillow that still smells like vanilla and delusion. A coffee mug with lipstick stains in the shape of goodbye. He's not mourning her. No, that would be too simple, too clean. He's mourning someone far more important. The version of himself that only existed when she was watching. I need you to understand something that will crack your chest open like a lobster at an expensive restaurant you took her to when you were still pretending money meant nothing. We don't fall in love with people. We fall in love with our reflection in their eyes, with the story they let us tell about ourselves, with the man we get to play when they're our audience. Think back, I dare you, to the first time she laughed at your joke. Not politely, not charitably, but really laughed, throwing her head back like she was exorcising demons of boredom. In that moment, you weren't just funny. You were the funniest man alive. You were Chaplin and Carlin and every court jester who ever turned pain into punchlines. You fell in love with that version of yourself, and you've been chasing that high ever since. The psychologists published a paper in 2025, The Mirror Syndrome in Romantic Attachment, but they dressed it up in jargon to hide the brutal truth. We're all narcissists in love with our own potential, and other people are just the screens we project our fantasies onto. They found that 87% of what we call chemistry is actually just someone reflecting back the version of ourselves we desperately want to believe in. Here's a story that's older than wine, but younger than regret. Pygmalion carved a statue so beautiful he fell in love with it. The gods, in their infinite cruelty, brought it to life. But what the myth doesn't tell you is that Pygmalion didn't fall in love with the statue. He fell in love with being the kind of artist who could create such beauty. When Galatea started talking, started having opinions about breakfast and bathroom habits, the spell broke. She was no longer his creation, but her own person. And suddenly, he was just another man with calloused hands and marble dust in his lungs. You remember the first time you disappointed her? Not in a big way, just a small failure, a missed cue, a joke that landed flat. The way her face changed, just for a second, like a channel switching. In that moment, you weren't her hero anymore. You were just another man who couldn't quite measure up to the billboard of himself he'd erected in her mind. And something inside you died. Not love for her, but love for who you got to be when she believed your advertising. I knew a man, perhaps his name was Everyone, who kept a journal of compliments. Not out of vanity, but out of fear. Every nice thing she said he wrote down, evidence that he was worthy of being loved. You make me feel safe. You're different from the others. I've never met anyone like you. He read them like scripture, like instructions for how to be himself. When she left, he kept reading them, trying to resurrect the man she'd described, not realizing that man only existed in the space between her expectations and his performance. Sartre wrote, "Hell is other people," but he was only half right. Hell is who we become for other people, the contortions we perform to fit into the shape of their desire. We're all method actors who've forgotten we're acting, who've lost ourselves so completely in the role that we mourn the character when the show gets canceled. The Cathedral of Unspoken Names is built from every version of yourself you've been for every woman who's ever looked at you like you might be someone special. The confident one, the sensitive one, the dangerous one, the safe one. All of them gathering dust like saint statues in an abandoned church. You light candles for them, these dead selves. These men you'll never be again because their audience has left the theater. But here's the twist that would make Kierkegaard laugh and cry simultaneously. The man she fell in love with was just as fictional as the one you were playing. You were both collaborating on a work of fiction, co-authors of a story where you were each other's favorite characters. The tragedy isn't that it ended. All stories end. The tragedy is that you forgot it was a story. A woman told me once, her name was either Sarah or every Sarah who ever lived. I miss who we were together. Not who I was, not who she was, who we were, that third entity that only existed in the space between us, that died the moment we stopped believing in it hard enough. You want the mathematics of heartbreak? Here's your equation. You minus her doesn't equal your original self. It equals a negative number, a deficit, because you added parts of yourself that only existed in relation to her. You became a person who knew her favorite song, who ordered her coffee just right, who could predict her moods by the way she tied her hair. All of that knowledge, all of those skills, suddenly useless, like speaking a dead language fluently, like being an expert in a country that no longer exists. Here's your fourth uncomfortable question, and this one comes with thorns. Who were you before you started performing yourself for her applause? Can you even remember, or have you been acting so long you've forgotten what your real voice sounds like? The cathedral echoes with unspoken names, not hers, but yours. All the versions of you that lived and died in the span of a relationship. The one who wrote poetry at 3 a.m. because she said you had beautiful thoughts. The one who learned to cook because she was vegetarian and you wanted to be the kind of man who could make eggplant taste like love. The one who was spontaneous, adventurous, deep, light, everything and nothing. A shapeshifter desperate to maintain the illusion that made her eyes light up. But cathedrals were built for resurrection, weren't they? And maybe, just maybe, buried under all those dead selves is someone you haven't met yet. Someone who exists without audience, without mirrors, without anyone to reflect him back to himself. Someone who is, simply and terrifyingly, himself. The real ghost in the cathedral isn't her. It's the man you could have been if you'd never tried to be the man you thought she wanted. The man who needs nothing becomes everything. Here we are. At the end, that's really a beginning. In the hour before dawn, when the world holds its breath and even the shadows seem to be listening. I'm going to tell you something that will sound like madness until the moment it becomes your only salvation. The cure for loneliness isn't company. It's falling in love with your own solitude until it becomes so complete, so sufficient, that another person becomes a choice rather than a necessity. There's a man I know. Let's call him no one. Let's call him everyone. Let's call him you in 3 years if you're brave enough, who lives in a small apartment overlooking a city that never sleeps. His shelves are full of books that talk back. His refrigerator contains exactly what he needs. His bed is the right kind of empty, not lonely, but spacious, like a canvas waiting for the right inspiration rather than any desperate splash of color. He wasn't always this way. Once, he was you, scrolling through dating apps like a slot machine player convinced the next pull would hit jackpot. He measured his worth in good morning texts, in +1s to weddings, in having someone to list as his emergency contact. But then came the fever break, the dark night of the soul that lasted 6 months, the kind of alone that teaches you to hear your own heartbeat and realize it's been keeping time without anyone else's permission. The Stoics called it autarkeia, self-sufficiency, the fortress of the self that needs no external validation to stand. But they made it sound like deprivation, like settling for less. They didn't understand what the mystics knew, what the mad saints discovered in their desert caves. When you become a complete universe unto yourself, you stop being a black hole sucking in love and start being a star that generates its own light. I'll tell you what happened to him. This no one who became everything. He started taking himself on dates, not in a sad way, not in a table for one, please way, but with the genuine curiosity of someone getting to know a fascinating stranger. He discovered he liked jazz, but only after midnight, that he could spend 3 hours in a museum talking to no one but the paintings, that his own company was actually quite good once he stopped apologizing for it. A study from Copenhagen, 2024, Those clever Danes who understand happiness like Americans understand hamburgers found something that should be carved into stone tablets. People who reported being comfortable alone for extended periods were 74% more likely to form healthy relationships when they did partner. Not because they'd learned to settle, but because they'd learned the difference between want and need, between choosing someone and requiring them for basic functioning. Here's what happens when you alchemize loneliness into solitude. You stop bleeding desperation from your pores. You stop interviewing for the position of someone to complete me, because the position has been eliminated. You become the kind of person who orders a drink at a bar and actually tastes it instead of scanning the room for validation. You become dangerous in the most beautiful way, unpredictable because you're not performing, magnetic because you're not trying to be. Rumi wrote, "Let yourself be silently drawn by the strange pull of what you really love. It will not lead you astray." But he buried the lead. What you really love, when you strip away all the noise and need and neurosis, might just be the sound of your own thoughts when they're not trying to impress anyone. I watched this man, this prophet of solitude, at a gallery opening last month. A woman approached him, beautiful in that way that makes men stupid, smart in that way that makes them stutter. They talked about the art, about the wine that tasted like disappointment, about the pretension of people who use words like liminal at parties. She gave him her number. He smiled, took it, put it in his pocket like it was a pleasant but non-essential gift, like finding a $20 bill in an old coat. He called her a week later, not because he'd been playing games, not because he'd read some guide about optimal response times, but because he'd been busy living his life, and a week was when he genuinely had space for something new. She was intrigued. They dated. And here's the beautiful paradox. She fell in love with him precisely because he didn't need her to. The philosopher's stone of solitude doesn't turn lead into gold. It reveals that you were gold all along, just covered in the lead of other people's expectations. It's not about becoming a hermit or a misanthrope. It's about becoming so genuinely fascinated by your own existence that another person becomes a delightful addition to an already complete symphony rather than the only instrument that makes sound. Thoreau went to the woods to live deliberately, but he got it backwards. You don't need to go to the woods. The woods are inside you. That quiet place where you exist without performance, without audience, without the exhausting need to be anything other than what you are in this moment. Reading these words, breathing this air, being gloriously, terrifyingly, magnificently alone. Here's your final mirror, and this one shows not who you were or who you pretend to be, but who you could become. What would you do tomorrow if you knew, really knew, that no one was coming to save you, complete you, or validate you? What life would you build if you were the only person you needed to impress? The man who needs nothing becomes everything because he stopped being a beggar at the feast of life, stopped settling for crumbs of affection, stopped mistaking desperation for passion. He's learned the secret that all the mystics knew, but were too kind to say directly. You can't actually love another person until you've learned to enjoy your own company so much that sharing it becomes an act of generosity rather than need. In the cathedral of his solitude, he's not waiting for anyone. He's not hoping, not yearning, not scrolling through possibilities. He's sitting with a book and a glass of wine, watching the sun set over a city full of people desperately trying not to be alone. And he's smiling. Not because he's superior, not because he's given up, but because he's discovered the last paradox. The only way to never be alone is to fall so deeply in love with solitude that loneliness becomes impossible. The only way to be loved correctly is to need it so little that you can finally see it clearly when it arrives. The only way to stop chasing what destroys you is to become so complete that destruction becomes a choice rather than a default. And somewhere, in an apartment that smells like coffee and contentment, a man who was once you is living proof that the philosopher's stone exists. He turned his loneliness into gold, and now he's rich in ways that have nothing to do with anyone else's poverty. The moth finally understood. It wasn't the flame he wanted. It was the ability to generate his own light.